delighted to invite Professor Lokaneeta for this talk, which has been postponed for more than a year for one reason or the other, due to sort of very urgent concerns for Jinee as well as in KCHR. So we couldn't hold it. We've tried to schedule it. This is finally happening. So I'm really very happy about this. Professor Lokaneeta is presently a professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Drew University in the USA. She has been writing and she has held different positions. She's taught in India and at other universities in the US before becoming a professor at Drew. She has written extensively, but let me briefly tell you about two very important pieces of work that she has done. One on transnational torture, law, violence, and state power in the United States and India, a comparative study. And more recently, the book based on which I think she will speak to us today, The Truth Machines, Policing Violence and Scientific Interrogations in India. Before I hand it over to Jinee, may I add that her work has actually really opened up ways for so many of us who are interested in questions about rule of law, on violence, how one actually theorizes ideas about sovereignty while keeping violence, or questions about resistance, thinking about torture and detention. All of these really are issues that she has thought very deeply about. And not only that, I must add that she has actually done very serious empirically based research. So a lot of her theoretical understanding on these issues comes out of a very grounded understanding of how to think about, questions about legal discourses, questions about this issue of truth and lies when one speaks about violence and politics, and how does one actually address the very, very tortured and difficult area of torture debates. Today's talk is entitled Policing in Liberal Democracies, Legal Violence and Scientific Interrogations in India. Now, I think that most of us know that this is an extremely important area, and I cannot thank Jinee enough for having agreed to come and speak in our forum. I'm sure this is going to be extremely valuable for every one of us who's attending this talk today. So thank you so much, Jinee. And just a couple of housekeeping announcements. May I request everybody to keep their volume on mute. And usually our process has been that we ask, after the speaker has spoken, we ask participants to type in their questions into the chat box, and that is actually read out to her. This is to save time, and so that the speaker can have more time in responding to queries and so on. But should anybody have any difficulty in typing in, please use the raise hand option and I will call on you. And finally, if anybody wishes, who's new to our forum and wishes to be added to our mailing list, please type in your mail ID and we will add it to our mailing list. Thank you so much. Over to you, Jinee.
Thank you so much. I'll just share my PowerPoint. All right. So thank you so much to Kerala Council for Historical Research and Professor G. Arunima for this invitation, and Dr. Fashia for all the organizing. I know that this was a much postponed talk, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this very distinguished series that has had a number of speakers, organizers, whose scholarship, work, and life I much admire, including Professor Arunima, with whom I've had the pleasure of such a long and wonderful association. So thank you for that. So today, focus on policing in liberal democracies, mostly drawing from my book, The Truth Machines, though I'll also try to consider whether some of the insights from the book can be developed a bit further when considered in the context of a case that I didn't focus on in the book, but has really changed at least some of the conversations on torture, state violence, and policing in India. So in my 2020 book, The Truth Machines, one of the main themes that I had pointed to was the role of actors in policing, including, but also beyond the police, to magistrates and even to semi-state actors such as forensic psychologists and medical professionals, to understand what I call the relationship between state power and legal violence in liberal democracies. I put forward the concept of the contingent state to conceptualize this relationship. So while a primary case study from the book is about the Mumbai blast case from 2006, I also focus in this presentation on a particular moment from June 2020 when Jairaj and Benix, a father-son duo, were brutally killed and tortured in police custody in Sathankulam, Tamil Nadu, which created unprecedented outrage against police killings, even as such violence is quite normalized otherwise. So my research has generally focused, as Professor Arunima said in her very generous introduction, that has generally been on the relationship between law, violence, and state power in liberal democracies. In my first book, Transnational Torture, focusing on India and US, I traced how jurisprudence that is considered the most legitimate state discourse formally condemns torture, yet ends up accommodating excess violence. In that work, I primarily focus on analyzing legal cases from both India and the United States in the post 9/11 context. I also analyzed reports and cultural representations of torture in TV shows like 24 to intervene in a debate on whether torture was an exception in liberal democracies, and argued that excess violence was very much a part of the governing in liberal democracies. In The Truth Machines, then I shifted from jurisprudence to also examine more closely state and semi-state actors who are responsible for interpreting and implementing the laws and safeguards against torture. Here I also present some of the other important recent scholarship on these themes. So let me start with just a very brief overview on what the Indian state's problem with custodial torture is. Torture in India is prevalent in distinct contexts. As human rights scholar, activist Gautam Navlakha, currently in jail, had once helped me systematically understand in an interview. In India, in routine cases, it is evident in the numerous custodial deaths that continue to occur even in theft or dispute cases. Think, for instance, the new Tamil film, Jai Bhim, where Rajakannu and his relatives from Irula tribe were brutally tortured in custody in a false case of theft. Now, the case is really about how the role of tribal, caste, class, and gender identities and assumption of habitual offenders form the experience with the police. Second is the context of terrorism and organized crime cases facilitated by extraordinary laws. Terrorism and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, or TADA, Prevention of Terrorism Act, POTA, Maharashtra Control of Organized Crime Act, MACOCA earlier, and now Unlawful Activities Prevention Act that evade routine safeguards against extended detention and delay in bail, often targeting Muslim bodies. Third, in the context of Kashmir, parts of the Northeast, and Punjab previously, where torture, detention, and disappearances are common because those who commit these crimes have virtual impunity, even as habeas petitions are denied. One can now start adding a fourth category, which doesn't neatly fit, that of targeting human rights activists and of foreclosing dissent. The refusal to give bail to vulnerable prisoners, despite an inability to avoid overcrowding during a pandemic, or putting them in anda or egg-shaped cell to punish them, or just to use detention as punishment against dissenters, as the denial of bail for many activists, including Umar Khalid and others, also makes these conditions inhuman and torturous. In all these contexts, victims of torture and custodial deaths are often from poorer and marginalized groups, including tribal, Dalits, women, transgender, and minorities, particularly Muslims, and as I noted earlier, those who dissent, though it could extend to others as well. If these are the contexts in which torture exists in India, the puzzle in my book, The Truth Machines, that I started off with is why, in a context where torture exists with such impunity and officials are rarely convicted or charged, partly because of an absence of a specific law against torture due to the non-ratification of the UN Convention Against Torture, how does a discourse on truth machines to replace physical torture appear? And how does it help us understand the relationship between state power and legal violence in liberal democracies? In addition to focusing on legal cases, reports, political discourses, and popular representations, I conducted interviews with police, forensic psychologists, lawyers, and activists in 5 cities: Delhi, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Bangalore, and Gandhinagar, visiting forensic science labs in these cities in order to understand the relationship between law, science, and policing. I focused on the emergence of 3 scientific techniques that I term truth machines: narcoanalysis, brain scans, and lie detectors. Very briefly, narcoanalysis is the injecting of sodium pentothal for inducing confessions or information, popularly, of course, known as the truth serum. The second is brain fingerprinting and its Indian version, brain electrical oscillation signature test, that supposedly captures experiential participation in a crime through an electroencephalogram, and lie detectors that measure physiological indicators. My focus is to study and understand the everyday practices of the state that are not captured by more monolithic conceptions of the state, whether it is a more Weberian, bureaucratic conception of monopoly over legitimate violence constrained by rules, or a more Agamben-inspired understanding of a sovereign state's violence over bare life. Here I draw more from the anthropologists of the state, such as Veena Das, Akhil Gupta, and others, and adopt a more ethnographic sensibility. I put forward the idea of a contingent state, which refers to the way states constantly oscillate between the desire to be unitary and an inability to do so under certain circumstances. The concept of the contingent state points to the continually negotiated nature of the relationship between state power and legal violence. For instance, if we just see the emergence of these techniques, it's both a story of a disaggregated arbitrariness on one hand and state intentionality on the other. There is often an assumption of clear intentionality in state techniques. So for instance, if we think about changes in methods of executions in the US, when it moved from hanging to lethal injections, as Austin Sarrett has written about, or from this idea of scarring to non-scarring, which doesn't leave marks in terms of torture techniques that Darius Rejali has talked about. But when we look at interviews with the Indian police and forensic psychologists, that suggests the contingent emergence and use of the techniques. Let me explain. The rise of these particular truth machines in India were actually the result of clear contingencies, where ambitious forensic psychologists in forensic science labs in Gandhinagar and Bangalore, wanting to gain visibility legally and in public, that led to popularization of these techniques. At some point, the truth machines also fitted the post-colonial Indian states' desire to appear as using scientific and modern techniques, in part due to the critiques of the human rights movement that was consolidating in the 1980s, 90s. It was primarily after 1975 to 1977 when there was an emergency declared by the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi due to internal disturbances and wide-scale torture and detentions took place during this time, that there was a consolidation of the human rights movement post-emergency to focus on protection of human rights. And one of the major issues was to how to deal with the question of custodial torture and deaths, particularly of political prisoners, although over time on custodial deaths and torture more generally. Groups such as People's Union for Democratic Rights and PUCL, People's Union for Civil Liberties, Andhra Pradesh Civil Liberties Committee, and international NGOs like Amnesty focused on these questions. So in other words, both due to internal and external pressures, India also set up a National Human Rights Commission that focused on custodial deaths. The 1990s also becomes a period when the Supreme Court jurisprudence on torture, like the D.K. Basu case, emerged, which used an expanded notion of due process using Article 21 of the Indian Constitution to acknowledge the pervasiveness of torture. The court, for instance, created safeguards such as arrest or custody memo to involve the family or public as a witness to the arrest, since illegal detention is fairly common, enabling torture. The court also notes the need for a pre-trial right to a lawyer and regular medical examinations, and the court has periodically focused on the implementation of the safeguards as well. When I trace the emergence and consolidation of the techniques, though lie detectors, of course, had existed earlier, it was only in the 1990s, the period I just talked about, that these techniques collectively emerged. And one of the primary reasons for its ascendance was that there was a claim that these techniques would replace physical torture. As a retired police officer in Bangalore put it, when I and others joined the police department, there was no narco analysis, or such things were unheard of. Only third degree and torturing the criminals was the method that was being used, which is not legal. Narco analysis came, human rights came. We had to use very patient methods, very slow detection. Breakthrough took some time, end quote. I suggest that it is in the 1990s, 2000s that the aspirations of individual forensic psychologists seem to merge with the need of the post-colonial Indian state to use science and expertise in order to find technical solutions for development, more generally, as Sri Rupa Roy has argued, but also for police torture. In some ways, it is similar to what Timothy Mitchell calls the technopolitics in the context of Egypt, an alloy of non-human and human, or what I called an attempt on the part of the primarily female forensic psychologists to be a cyborg of sorts, a combination of scientific machines and use of therapeutic art to be distinguished from the brutal police. The ills of the Indian criminal justice system were to be addressed by the developmentalist state to create what I call a state forensic architecture with machines and experts, with no regard for reliability or validity of these techniques or consideration of their coercive aspects. Thus, the state's modernization paradigm welcomed these techniques as crucial for police reform. In fact, the state high courts in mid-2000s that considered the constitutionality of these techniques basically upheld these techniques as replacing physical torture by involving medics and as a natural extension of the investigation. They were considered safe as they represented modernization similar to other life-saving machines like the MRI. In the state of Andhra Pradesh versus Srimati Inapura Padma and others, for instance, the court notes, in the accusations made in India, the police are attributed with applying third-degree methods in eliciting information, and there are instances of culprits or suspects dying in lockups during the course of interrogation on account of application of third-degree methods. Therefore, there's a blame that the Indian police are flagrantly violating the human rights. Therefore, there's every need to apply scientific techniques or tests to elicit the information from the culprits, the court says. The truth machines were only available in very few labs, though my interviews revealed that there was initially a plan to build a huge network of these truth machines at the district levels with mobile forensic science labs, and was a developmental priority for the Indian state. The Supreme Court, even when it intervened in 2010, while unequivocally ruling out the involuntary use of the techniques, focused mostly on consent and inadmissibility of evidence as a result of these techniques, though allowed for exceptions in terms of admissibility. In the process, even the highest court doesn't question the paradigm itself of using questionable science, of allowing medical professionals who had played an uneven role against torture even in the past, and doesn't completely challenge conditions of police custody or remand, which in many instances is often seen as synonymous with torture. The truth machines, of course, didn't actually replace physical torture because they got used in very few cases, are themselves coercive, and they often got used alongside physical torture for terrorism-related cases in order to get particular answers. So let me explain with the help of the Mumbai blast case first. On July 11, 2006, 7 bombings occurred on local trains in Mumbai. 189 people were killed and over 800 were injured. Once the anti-terrorism squad Mumbai took over, 13 Muslim men were charged with the crime having been charged under the Indian Penal Code, as well as 2 extraordinary laws, the 1967 UAPA and the 1999 MACOCA. And in 2015, 12 of them were convicted and 1 acquitted. All the accused were reportedly tortured, and 12 of them confessed. Methods of torture included electric shocks and beatings with a flour mill belt. As one recounted, the police started beating me by flour mill belt and sticks on my palm and soles. I was tied by rope and given electric shock to my private parts. Other methods included stripping men naked, putting them in stress positions, beating the palms of their hands and feet, and forcing them to sit with their feet at 180 degrees. One detainee mentioned the injecting of liquid chemicals through the anus. A torture room of the anti-terrorism squad figures in these narratives. Other methods of instilling fear were threats of torture, detention, and extrajudicial killing, together with the targeting of family members, including the threat of rape for women. Family members might be brought to the station to be harassed and insulted, and occasionally also subjected to stripping and beating. Narco analysis played a prominent role in the Mumbai blast case and draws our attention to what I call the semi-state actors. The concept of contingent state that I propose in the book, as opposed to a unitary or exceptional state, helps us think about the role of other actors involved in policing, namely here the forensic psychologists who claim that they are different from the police and provide therapy as an extension of the police. As one psychologist said, I quote, while torture is an external stimuli, these techniques are internal ones and invite an internal journey. They force you to review your past in a different way, not confess, but ask them to think about themselves and come back. It is a moment of catharsis in the legal system. Unlike the police custody where there's fear of encounter or custodial death or torture, here there is empathy, end quote. In the Mumbai Blast case of 2006, Abdul Wahid Sheikh, the only one acquitted, an author of an incredibly stringent critique of the Indian criminal justice system, Beguna Kaidi or Innocent Prisoners, which has now been translated from English into English from Hindi and Urdu, also initially believed that the truth machines conducted by the doctors would reveal the truth about his innocence, until he realized that it wasn't to be. The psychologists even claim that the techniques won't actually work if the persons are physically or psychologically harmed, gesturing to a shift in the mode of interrogations. But then, of course, they end up creating the same conditions in labs and hospitals that prop up physical torture by utilizing these coercive machines to get confessions involuntarily and therefore need to be squarely rejected. Yet the management of the violence and the actors beyond the police are important to recognize in their disaggregated and multifaceted form. So why were the truth machines a problem? Medical ethics scholar and activist Amar Jesani characterizes narcoanalysis as a form of pharmacological torture. Torture, in fact, remains torture even if it does not spill blood, break bones, and is done in sterile, air-conditioned operation theaters, end quote. Similarly, PUDR noted, narcoanalysis negates protections by making redundant the right to silence of the subject. And this is even ignoring the fact that there is no scientific and reliability and validity of these tests. The possibilities of manipulation in narcoanalysis was tremendous. In the Mumbai Blast case, the accused insisted that they were forcibly asked to consent to narcoanalysis. Consent in custody, thus, is a charged concept, as one account demonstrates. Dr. Malini, one of the more infamous forensic psychologists in Bangalore, misbehaved and slapped me twice before the test. They asked me to say some things before a video camera and beat me before asking me to say the sentences. She threatened that if I do not give correct answers, she would give me AIDS injection. I became semi-conscious after the injection of narco test was given. She asked illogical questions to me during this condition. The camera was switched on, and first she asked how many bombs were prepared. I answered that I'm not concerned and I'm falsely involved. She slapped me strongly and started pinching my left ear with pliers, because of which I suffered much. She then asked me what comes after 6, and I answered 7. She asked me on what TV operates, and I answered that it operates on electricity. She again strapped me strongly and caught my ear with pliers and told me to say by remote. She asked me many such illogical questions and used to ask me to repeat the answers if I did not give the expected answers. Both tortured me badly during the test, end quote. This instance appeared to violate even the self-proclaimed standards for narcoanalysis by state officials. In other words, to be conducted safely in a hospital or forensic laboratory. Pliers were reportedly used during the procedure, illogical questions were asked, and specified answers demanded. Each test concluded with an interrogator's insistence for a signature on a tailored confession. The depositions in these cases thus undermine any claim to replacing torture with narcoanalysis and police with forensic psychologists, and how merely ensuring consent may not mean much. The simultaneity of torture and truth machines is important here. Torture leads to a confession that must be recreated through a non-physical scientific technique. CDs from narcoanalysis sessions were edited to suit the police narrative. As a lawyer described the account of one of the accused, he said, "They played the CD of the narco test to me, and I was shocked to see that in place of my reply to the question as to how many bombs were prepared, the reply was 7. Anyone could see that the CD was edited because the words were not in sync with the video." End quote. As Sheikh warns, suspects should never answer in the negative because their responses could be manipulated to appear as if they are answering other questions. The video camera thus becomes a means for generating public confessions. So when one thinks of the link between these truth machines to torture, it is not just that the techniques are coercive, but also in the fact that they are used to legitimize a shift in physical torture as a way for a democracy to show its commitment to a rule of law, of dealing with torture, even as it was never replaced, and merely created another site for extraction of confessions, this time with the help of science and experts, which fit the modernizing narrative, the civilizational discourse that all liberal states claim and post-colonial states in particular strive for. The notion of contingent state thus helps both capture the experience of those impacted by the violence, but also has points of intersection with the police accounts in terms of what creates a possibility of resistance or break from within the state violence. Sheikh reveals what the police are constrained by: a dead body in custody, and he writes, लेकिन याद रखिए पुलिस आपको टॉर्चर से मार नहीं डालेगी, वो तो केवल इतना मारेगी कि आप डर कर उसका काम कर दें, वो इस तरह नहीं मारेगी जिससे गहरे जख्म हो, इसलिए पूरी कोशिश करें कि कैमरा के सामने कोई बयान न दे. But you should remember that the police will not kill you with the torture. They will only beat you to the extent that you agree to do their work. The police won't beat you in such a way that there are physical wounds. So try your best not to give a statement in front of a camera. This sentiment is echoed by a police officer in a training academy who connected the human rights movement, the National Human Rights Commission reports, and the D.K. Basu case. These, he believed, collectively made the police much more nervous about deaths in custody. I quote, the suspect's safety is in your custody. You don't want him to die, so you take care of him, your brother. You're scared of death. End quote. Often the Indian police is understood mostly as either a colonial continuity, as Dina Heath and Radha Kumar have shown more recently, or inspired by the more Marxist or critical conceptions of the state. Police are seen, for instance, as repressive institutions of the state, implying that they do not require much scrutiny, as Sudipto Kaviraj and Partho Chatterjee's work suggests. But these insights are revealed less in my interviews. So in this limited sense, drawing from new police studies scholars, I term it the pastoral role of the police mediating the coercive. I point to how studying the police as a site of state power in the everyday sense allows for an access into the structural constraints of the police, but also reveal in their own words the pragmatic logic of why third degree continues. It is the fear of the custodial death that has allowed for the mediation of the coercive with the pastoral. The emergence of these truth machines thus helps one understand the vacillations of the contingent state and whether there are shifts and cracks possible in both the narratives and practices of the state that have life and death consequences for those who actually experience state violence. Here, I also want to note the role of the magistrates and doctors in the Mumbai case required by law to ensure protections against torture. The magistrates in front of whom these men were produced rarely inquired into their cases. Before each hearing, the accused were threatened not to reveal their experiences. As one detainee noted, the police threatened that if we complain about beating and torture, they would involve our family members in the case and would torture us more. Therefore, I did not say anything before the judge because of the fear. If they protested, the accused were tortured again. One had an infected ear from the use of pliers, but he was warned not to complain or the torture would be even more brutal. One detainee described waterboarding. A wet cloth was put on my face because of which I was not able to breathe. They had an apparatus with them by which probably they were measuring my blood pressure, and after a certain level was reached, they used to remove the cloth. Only when he agreed to confess did the torture stop. He was then given some ointments or taken to the hospital where he was warned not to complain to the doctor. Only occasionally he recalled would a magistrate ask for a medical examination, but doctors overlooked his injuries even when they were aware of severe torture. Before a court hearing, suspects might be allowed to sleep so that they do not appear tortured in front of the magistrate. As one accused explained, I was taken for medical checkup many times during police custody, but was not physically checked by the doctors, not allowed to speak with the doctors. The veil was not removed at any time, but only my thumb impressions were taken. After his brother was also tortured, another of the accused realized that the panchnamas, the documents he was forced to sign, involved recovery of admissible evidence. The body must provide oral proof. Doctors and magistrates who are by law charged with ensuring the veracity of procedures thus fail to challenge the forcible extraction. As a lawyer in another terrorism-related case said, so my question is, how come the judiciary, how come those magistrates who remanded these boys without complying with that mandatory requirement of the Supreme Court, how come disciplinary action was not taken against them? End quote. In the absence of action against judges who convict on flimsy evidence or magistrates who fail to follow the safeguards against torture, this lawyer noted, otherwise, what is the message I get as a Muslim? They were able to play football with your life, your career, your human rights, and this, damn all that you can do about it. And what's the message judges will get? Play whatever games you can, you are immune. End quote. Each step in the procedure must be followed even as it is substantively undermined. Even under Makoka, used in the Mumbai case, the confession must be voluntary. The Deputy Commissioner of Police must warn the accused without police pressure about the right to silence and then ask to repeat the confession in front of a magistrate who ensures a medical examination outside police custody. All these measures ostensibly ensure that a suspect confessed voluntarily and not due to torture or pressure. But in practice, each step becomes a little more than a bureaucratic check mark, indicative more of a scaffolding than ensuring the rights of the accused. Rather than revealing the violence, the state and semi-state actors mask the violence through these bureaucratic check marks. The procedures are technically followed, thereby preserving what I term the scaffold of the rule of law, and ends up invisibilizing the state violence. Ultimately, the scaffolding keeps these elements of the system in place, providing a facet of a rational bureaucratic system. For Foucault, who writes of the spectacle of the scaffold through public execution and torture confirmed the truth of the crime in public. The scaffold of the rule of law, I argue, however, ensures the truth of the crime in public through procedures meant to avoid the theatrical production of torture by actually masking it. Thus, when the definition of the rule of law primarily focuses on primary or formal procedural safeguards and judiciary's role in protecting individual rights, the violence within is hidden. The detainee narratives thus help reveal the violence and also challenge those who keep it in place. When we focus just on the police, we fail to notice how the scaffold of the rule of law is created collectively by police, magistrates, and doctors. This insight became even more visible in the Jairaj and Benix case in June 2020 that I mentioned at the beginning. So I want to talk a little bit about this case and then in my presentation. Initially, the reports in the Jairaj and Benix case noted that the police arrested the father-son duo in relation to the COVID lockdown violations. Though even early on, the shopkeepers who protested right after the custodial deaths revealed that the father and son were detained separately. The witness statements in the charge sheet very clearly indicate what exactly happened, though interestingly, the lockdown story continued to have a resonance in some of the statements. The charge sheet notes that on June 19 at 7:30 p.m., police officials picked up Jairaj in a Tata Sumo. When someone informed his son Benix about the arrest, he rushed to the car to ask for the reasons of arrest. He was told to follow up in the police station. When Benix went to the police station with a couple of friends, including a lawyer, he saw his father being beaten up. A scuffle ensued between the police officials and Benix, and the latter too was wrongfully confined. Beatings continued on Benix and Jairaj for several hours. In fact, the charge sheet notes that the inspector continually encouraged the beating of Benix in particular to teach him a lesson on how to behave with police. To give a brief description of the torture, the deceased's clothes were removed to add to the brutality of torture. Both Jairaj and Benix, turn by turn, were made to bow down on a wooden table in underwear only. Their hands and legs were caught hold by accused police officials so that they were not able to defend themselves. While holding them in that position, they were subjected to severe beatings with lathi on their buttocks, back, and other parts of the body. Though Jairaj begged that given his high BP and diabetic condition, he would not be able to sustain such grievous injuries, still no one paid any heed, and the accused police officials continued with several rounds of brutal torture with intervals in between 7:45 p.m. and 3 a.m. That night. Now, the charge sheet also notes that once there was a recognition that the multiple injuries were sufficient in the ordinary course of nature to cause their death, and there had been some witnesses, including advocates in the police station, of FIR was falsely created about COVID violations and an altercation with the police. Now, Jairaj and Benix, as per the law, were taken to the hospital for pre-remand checkup, and Dr. Vanilla declared them fit for remand. They were then taken in front of the judicial magistrate, who remanded them to judicial custody, and basically they were sent to a sub-jail. At this sub-jail, the admission register noted the severe injuries on their bodies, and the jail doctor also examined them, treated them. But in the evening, then finally, both of them had a certain worsening of their situation, and they both subsequently died in a hospital. Now, on one hand, you can see here that basically, they did get the protections under the law. They were taken to the for medical examination and then taken in front of the magistrate as well. However, I would say that two things are really important in this particular case that I'm currently trying to think through and write about. One is that throughout you see that there was evidence of brutal torture that was visible. So in fact, one of the most remarkable parts of this case is that often we come to know about the torture only when there's a postmortem or an inquest and so on, right? But here, actually, witness statements show that the evidence of torture was visible all through in the entire 2 days that they were in custody, because family was present, lawyers were present, and other hospital workers witnessed it. And yet that visibility was incapable of saving the lives of Jairaj and Benix. Now, the second point that I'll make, and this is where I'll finish, unlike other cases of custodial deaths where justice may be elusive, here, thanks to the protests that echoed George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's protests in the US, as well as the intervention of the Madras High Court, a swift investigation occurred and the trial is currently on. But I do want to focus on an unaddressed aspect. On one hand, it appears again to be a case of a scaffold of a rule of law where the doctor and magistrate help hide the violence. On the other hand, when one reads the witness statements carefully, one finds that this was not even a case where the violence was hidden. Police continued to beat them for hours, even when family and lawyers were standing outside. The medical fitness for remand was written even as clothes needed to be changed twice because of as they bled, and family and friends could witness the injured bodies, the limping, the bloodstains, and so on. And yet the doctor could consider them fit for remand. And the magistrate could send them for judicial custody, standing from the second floor of the court building. Similarly, even though the prison authorities noted down the extensive injuries and called in a doctor and sent them later to the hospital, when the prison superintendent was asked, why is it that you just admitted them with severe injuries without sending them to the hospital more early on? He said that basically they were sent in with a police fit for remand certificate. So all we need to do is to admit the prisoners with injuries, mentioning that in the admissions book. He also said that most of the prisoners, almost 50% brought to this jail, had similar kinds of injuries. So that's the reason why they don't send them to the jail immediately unless and until they worsen. Hence, even when it's not about hiding, right, the masking that I wrote about earlier, it's about managing the procedural system mechanically than really about safeguarding the life and dignity in custody for which the protections are meant to be. Hence, one needs to think about justice in custody before the violence takes place, not just after, something that my current work is now focusing on. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jinee. That was really very important. And I think it raises lots of questions. I'm sure people have lots of questions. I certainly have one or two. For those of us who have been thinking about issues about human rights, the ways in which the so-called exceptional laws are being used in this country, and of course, what happens once you're incarcerated. May I request that the audience, if they have questions, could they type in their questions and we can take them one by one. I'm happy to start you off with a question of mine. just to sort of get the, okay, I think Chebulu Manasa has a question. Maybe we'll take that first.
Hi, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. You are.
Yeah. I have few questions, so that can I proceed with that?
Yes.
Yeah. Ma'am, for example, if I'm trying to overcome my lie in front of the lie detector, if I control my heart rate or if I sync with the frequency of a lie detector instrument, can we really hide the lie?
Do you want me to respond now, or do you want to?
Yes, ma'am, you can.
Jinee, it's up to you. If you want to take a few questions, you can. Otherwise, you can just respond.
Okay, yeah. No, so I think you're absolutely, right to raise questions about validity and reliability of the lie detector. I think a lot of, and I didn't go into that. I talk a little bit more about all this in the book. But there's also extensive work on lie detectors for a very long time, which suggests that basically lie detectors are not that effective in terms of really being able to detect deception, right? And so as a result, there are also these studies which show that there are how to beat a lie detector, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I would totally say that, this is one of those, techniques where basically it came at a time. And for me, what was interesting is whether it's in the US or in India or elsewhere, it often came as a way to say that, oh, here's a machine which can help replace third degree, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, there's this amazing book by Jeffrey Bunn, which actually talks about how, even when it was clear that it was not that effective, what actually helped it sort of continue was this idea of a spectacle of science, right? Anything which
Yeah.
sounds scientific, you want to sort of, uphold. And
Yeah.
basically, as a result, what popularized it was actually pulp fiction and other things, as opposed to sort of actually scientific techniques, right? And yet you can imagine that even now there are debates on, lie detectors being used despite its lack of reliability and accountability.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, without using any instruments like manually via using psychology doctor or by using forensic methods, can we really get things out well?
So I think, again, I will say that, my focus had been, on these three particular techniques. I talked about lie detectors, and then, I also talk about truth serums, as well as brain scans, right? Those were the
Yeah.
three. And in each of those, the forensic psychologists actually play a very major role, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And part of what I am interested in is really sort of thinking about this overemphasis on being able to take the try and get the truth from one's own body, right? Forcing the body to basically give information against oneself, right? So, and which in some ways is actually, and just to give you an example, right? So what happens in narcoanalysis is that you're actually given a drug which then, basically numbs you or disables your ability to be fully conscious, right? So
Yeah.
this act itself is not allowing you to basically, have full control over your senses, right? Which is sort
Yes.
of what is extremely important when you are thinking about voluntariness, right? So
Yes.
rather than overemphasizing the role of the forensic psychologist, I think one has to ask, why is it that these kind of techniques are relied upon much more rather than improving other kinds of investigative possibilities? And that's sort of my emphasis.
Fine. Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Rajeshwari Pitambaran has a question. She asks, kindly share about cyber forensic and digital policies over the accused in the liberal democracy as a tool of hegemony. What's your perception?
Right. So I think I'm not entirely sure, how the question has been phrased, but what comes to my mind is sort of this idea that in some ways, when we are thinking about forensics, right, it brings in this idea that science and experts, right, will automatically give us the kind of solution that we need in order to deal with all the problems of policing, right? And part of what, and in that sense, the science and expertise become the hegemonic tool, right? Basically, for a liberal state to say that, we are taking you in this direction, right? Partly because this is what is going to really get to the truth, and we ensure this because there's a scientific claim and there are experts, and the very presence of that is going to create a kind of a hegemonic project, right? So for instance, what has been remarkable for me is that even though, I think 2000s was really the time when all major important cases, suddenly narcoanalysis and brain scans and lie detectors were used, right? So basically, whether it's the Mumbai case that I talked about, but also Arushi, Telgi, right? All these cases, though they were not just restricted to sensational cases, they were extended to many other kinds of theft, poaching, other kinds of cases as well. Now, but even now, when there's a prominent case that comes up, right, whether it's that Dhanbad judge case or Hathras or, right now Sonali Phogat, right? Immediately they start talking about narcoanalysis and brain scan, right? And you sort of wonder, what is it that, unlike other countries where, there's an emphasis to basically develop other kinds of investigative skills, whether it's DNA based or, other kinds of forensic techniques, or just, giving much more emphasis to investigations of other kinds. Why is it that it comes back to this question of, the body itself being forced to provide the truth? And that sort of tells us something about the way in which, that's been the focus, and which is why it became very important for me to challenge this particular kind of hegemonic tool based on science and expertise, right? If you recall, even when the criminal identification bill sort of was introduced, immediately there was this concern about whether it's going to bring back narcoanalysis and so on in a big way. So I'm sort of, in a sense, asking us to say that why is it that in this particular instance there is an emphasis on forcing the body? Thank you.
All right. Jinee, there are 3 sets of questions. So would you like to take them one by one? I can read them to you.
Sure.
All right. One is, the first is Gopika Amarnath, who wants to know about the Mumbai blast case.
Okay. So, so I think, I spent a little bit of time in the presentation about the Mumbai blast case. And, I would really recommend Abdul Wahid Sheikh's book, which I think does an amazing job in terms of not just talking about the case itself, although it does obviously talk about that. He's one of the people who were acquitted, in the case. But what it does is really tells us how the Indian criminal justice system and policing apparatus actually works. And, Professor Arunima is showing the books.
For those who are interested, please get copies.
Absolutely. And I think, two things that I want to emphasize there is one, it also tells us the relationship between, routine policing, right? What is the pressures on the police, which is also something, he talks about. I also, and many other policing scholars sort of, talk about what are the political pressures, what are the, criminal justice based pressures that are there on the police and how they deal with that. And second is sort of, how it's very important for us to recognize and focus on all the different aspects of an investigation, right? Which until now, I would say, doesn't get as much focus. And the identity of those who are most directly impacted by the policing apparatus, right? So I think, those are some of the things that come out very clearly in terms of the Mumbai case that, I sort of focus on. And I would really urge, you to sort of take a look at this book as a way to maybe understand it a little more. Thank you.
The next set of questions is from Rachel Verghese. She asks, she says, thank you for that very insightful talk. I have two queries. One, could you elaborate a bit more on how the truth machines are treated inside the courtroom? Is there a way in which the judges act as interpreters of the expert opinion or evidence, especially in instances where the evidence is challenged? The second is, have you seen any notable difference in the way the truth machines work in the US and the Indian courtrooms?
All right, thank you. So let me say the first thing, right? So I guess the question about how the evidence as a result of truth machines are considered in the courtroom, there is a story which is pre-2010, and then there is a story which is post-2010, right? So pre-2010, because basically the legal status of these particular techniques was unclear, and therefore it depended on particular case, judges who decided whether, the evidence as a result of these techniques can be used or not. So that's number one. And so, for instance, just to give you one quick example, that there's this Aditi Sharma case where basically she and her friend were accused of killing another young man, and basically it seemed as if the judge had used the results of brain scans in sort of convicting them, although the High Court basically did not uphold that judgment, right? So there are many such cases. Again, not a lot was ever done systematically on these cases, right? And so, but I do know that there was much more reliance on that, and forensic psychologists went to court and gave evidence, and but it all depended on the discretion of the individual judges as to how they basically considered them. The second, part of the story is, once the Supreme Court said that, evidence cannot be used directly, it's true that its popularity seemed to wane, right? But as I said, in many major cases, there's a demand still to basically bring it up in some instance. And because it's at the level of the investigation itself, right? So it may never reach the court, right? But if you look, and, I do this much more clearly in the book than in my presentation, I sort of point to the fact that the way in which these machines got used, it somehow became an opportunity to get to confessions, right? Or some kind of, sort of information, which then gets used, right? Directly or indirectly. So it may actually never, reach the courtroom per se, right? But it still plays a role. And one final part before I go to the next question is really that, if you think about what happens in the court of cultural opinion, right? So for instance, the Arushi case, the evidence could not directly be used either to, sort of free the parents or, be used against the other set of people who were against whom narco analysis was done, that is the friends of Hemraj, right? But what is very, very interesting is that the public petitions that were used to challenge the conviction of Arushi's parents ended up overemphasizing the role of narcoanalysis, right? So even if legally it doesn't get used, right? So we often focus on the legal debates, as we should. That's really, really important. But it may be important for us to also look at the more, cultural, the popular, right, role that these techniques also play. In the context of the US, lie detectors, I think there is state-wise jurisdiction on whether lie detector results can be used or not. But in some ways it gets used, but may or may not go directly into becoming major evidence in a case. Brain scans are really the ones that are still pushing. There are companies that are and individuals who are constantly pushing for this to be used for legal purposes, while the current literature suggests that it may not actually be ready for use in legal context. Narcoanalysis is actually not really used in criminal cases. There was some evidence that post 9/11, they tried to use it indirectly, but never really ended up passing a policy as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jinee. Jeevan Kolangadan has a set of questions again. Thank you, ma'am, for that wonderful presentation. I have a few questions. One, how scientific are these evidences resulting from the so-called scientific investigation techniques? What good it actually is if narcoanalysis is pharmacological torture, as you said? Second, are these scientific evidences considered as the evidence in law courts or as supportive evidence? I think you have addressed some of this, but perhaps speak to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so I'll just add maybe a couple of things. One, what is very, very important is to recognize that, and I think one of the persons who most brought our attention to, I think, the role of medical professionals more generally in the context of custodial violence, as well as on narcoanalysis, is actually Dr. Amar Jesani. Again, his work is extremely influential in helping us think this through. And it was precisely sort of saying that because and I think I sort of mentioned how even high courts initially were very enthusiastic. I only presented from one court, but a bunch of high courts basically were very enthusiastic about these techniques. And they said that what is wrong with these human rights activists? Why are they opposing these narcoanalysis like techniques? Because after all, you have a person in a hospital in the presence of many doctors, right? Monitoring their situation. Isn't this a better way in which basically you are ensuring the safety of a person while asking them questions? And part of Ahmed Jesani's critique, and also critiques from others, suggested that basically, first of all, even giving something as invasive as a drug can have medical complications, right? And that was one of the big things. Second thing is, you are taking away the ability of a person, right, to decide what they wanted to do with their own bodies, right? And one of the very dangerous arguments made by the court was to say, look, it's like a MRI, right? It's done for your, safety. And so by making these comparisons, it was uncritically allowing for the legitimacy of some of these techniques. And therefore, as you said, right, it wasn't, sound medically. And also, if I did an analysis of some of these narcoanalysis videos, and a lot of it is sort of mixed with many other things. They'll be talking about the case, and then suddenly they'll say, oh, but I love Madhuri Dixit, or, I did something else, right? And so it is basically your mind, just spewing out a bunch of different things, which of course also has the impact of not being legally, right, or any other way useful as well. So thank you.
I think that's the end of the written questions here. You have already addressed the question about truth machines endlessly, so I'm not going to ask you to speak to that, because Gopika Amarnath wants you to speak about truth machines. And that's what this entire talk has been about. I have a couple of things that I just wanted to, these are not really questions, but I just wanted to share these with you, Jinee. One is, you must have seen, or rather read, Josie Joseph's Silent Coup, right? Now he speaks about the deep state, right? So the point there being that there's so much about things that are secret and silent and shadow agencies and a parallel government. So in a way, there's much that is actually taking place that's off the scenes. And we don't even know where these places are. And, that's the way in which this entire management, as it were, of so much, be it surveillance to torture, to harassment, to arrests, all of these things is actually taking place in precisely sort of offstage kind of things, right? So there is going to be no way in which we will ever have any access to any of that. Of course, for many of us, the immediate thought that comes to mind is old-fashioned physical torture, right? We do not imagine that these would be places where there's an enactment of the rational state, as it were, some kind of way of representing, the truth machine's sort of validity, as it were, because in some ways, what is it that the truth machine is sort of providing validity to a kind of governance that speaks to this question of, actually being able to produce truth, right? Despite the fact that we are continuously, the referent is the confession. Right. And the confession, of course, as we know, is what is produced through enactments of a variety of ways, corporeal enactments, as it were. So whether it's Guantanamo, or whether it's Abu Ghraib, or whether it's any place in India, whether it's Anda or whatever. Right? So there's that. So what does one then do? How does one even speak to this question about torture or truth machines when actually it's all off stage, right? So much of it is the deep state. And in today's India, and that's, I mean, you know, the many of the kinds of contexts from which we speak, things are changing rapidly. I mean, on the one hand, the almost ubiquitous usage of the UAPA has become such that on the one hand, there is an assumption that you are guilty, and neither court nor torture is even necessary. You just need to be incarcerated, right? And you just need to sort of languish there forever. And I mean, of course, that's not entirely unique to this period. We know that from Koban Gandhi onwards, I mean, the ways in which, you know, process as punishment, as it were. You're shunted around, your case is never heard, you're going to be in jail for God knows how many decades. If you're lucky, you're going to come out. And on the other hand, you have Abdul Wahid Sheikh kind of situation. And I was actually at a talk that he had done in JNU, the students had organized years ago. And what more than any of this, I think what was deeply heartbreaking and disturbing was the fact that he very openly said that, you know, I don't know what's going to happen to me. Somebody will bump me off at any time. I mean, I'm just taking my life in my hands and coming and speaking to you about this because I want you to know. So there's something about testimonies of this kind, right, which speak against. So here's a counter truth, right? The truth machine produces one kind of truth, and the testimonial form of these memoirs or ways of, I mean, this is a very unique, Begunah Kaidi is a very different kind of text. I mean, in a way, he's offering it up as a kind of legal dossier, isn't it?
Right.
But the others are not exactly the same. But there have been so many recent prison memoirs. People have been writing continuously about what that experience was of, you know, incarceration and what it does to the body and what it actually does to one's sense of self. And, you know, this, so there is something about positioning the kind of so-called desire of the state to appear scientific in the spectrum of sets of things that's actually happening. An extrajudicial kind of life of the you know, deep state, a way in which say something like the UAPA is changing the ways in which we even understand. I mean, truth production has ceased to matter. I mean, look at Umar's case. The Delhi police produces a bizarre document that runs into tens of thousands of pages. Apparently with all kinds of detail about it and so on. And, you know, so, but that aside, I mean, the specificities of that aside, I find the use of the sort of almost naturalized use of the UAPA quite significant in terms of doing away with courts and doing away with, I mean, you may torture on the side because that's what happens, but the idea that truth must be produced in order to have a kind of position on the issue seems to have gone away. So what do we do with that? How do we position, say, something like this moment that you were talking about? Is there something that has shifted in today's India, do you think? I mean, that's the question for you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, that's a really important question that one grapples with, you know, constantly. And I will say that one of the things that I also really liked in Josie Joseph's book, right, is that oftentimes we think about police in very broad terms, and part of it is, you know, how do we now think about the many different you know, state agencies, right, which actually play a much bigger role. And I will say that there are some very interesting you know, court cases which try to precisely get to the point of who's a police officer, right? You know, and basically because based on that is really the determination of whether some protections are available or not, right? So I think it's a very helpful sort of way to sort of think about it. So in some ways, I do agree that the current moment, right, has revealed a lot of challenges which are unprecedented in terms of the intensity with which, right, basically detentions can be done, right, the way in which basically the same laws which have pre-existed earlier, right, but take a form that becomes just very, very difficult to challenge at any level, right? So I think, and then more and more, right, whether it's sort of the ability to do surveillance, right, and is makes it a very, very difficult, moment, right? But I will say that for me, what particularly in the Indian case, because some of these techniques and these strategies of the state had existed in different forms, right, in particular regions, against particular communities, right, had this tendency of also just routinely taking over because of the way in which a lot of things are actually present within the CRPC, right, the routine law itself, right? For me, what is very, very important actually is precisely what you said at the end, which is that in this last 10 to 15 years, and as somebody who's, sort of really seen this domain very closely, I find that the focus on policing, torture, and state violence, right, both at the level of scholarship, right, there was always sort of, a human rights sort of focus, right, but I would say that to the extent that that has become a major part of both the scholarship as well as the kind of, testimonies, memoirs, right, has actually done the work much more of revealing, right, than we had ever seen before. And there I think that what it ends up doing, right, and this is why, Abdul Wahid Sheikh's work does it most systematically, of course, right, because he's talking about not just the torture that occurs, but how do you avoid police torture, right? Yes, he has a whole primer on that, yeah, right? But even all the others, whether it's Kobat Gandhi or, Amir, Muhammad Amir Khan's work and so on, right? All of those actually do a breaking of silence about very, very detailed ways through which policing and the larger apparatus work, right?
Absolutely.
And to that extent, when have we ever seen the kind of, focus on what a charge sheet is, or, how interrogation takes place, right? And I think there is it, it's almost like the everyday police practices that go into creating, what I say, the masking or the scaffold, but really helps us also reveal and challenge it, right? And however much the political will, right, tries to sort of intensify the intensify sort of the targeting, the very fact that there's some desire to create that facade of a rule of law also means that somewhere or the other, the processes and procedures, actually have to have some kind of, coming together, which then also reveals its own, illogic, right? And sometimes forces the courts, even when they may or may not want to do so, right, to basically acknowledge some of the arbitrariness. And, that sort of, I think, is, a moment that probably provides some hope. It's not a lot, but I do think that we see that in the US context, where decades of scholarship and grassroots activism came together to really sort of focus on policing. I would say that in the Indian context, because of very, very, again, repressive conditions, right? You still see sort of some of these threats coming together in ways that we haven't actually seen before.
Thank you.
Uh,
Michael, is
can
there
I-
anything? Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Thank you, Professor Lokaneeta, for a very brilliant presentation.
We can't hear you. You muted
I think-
yourself.
Yeah, I've got a basic kind of a question that the movement, the charge sheeting, the original charge sheeting, is of a social nature. Well, what I mean is that it may be an encounter at the individual level, but it might have been planned or deliberately turned out to curb the initiative taken by a gender group or a caste group or a class group. When you have a social dimension attached to the so-called alleged crime, how far can truth machine work? I mean, the sense that because it implies that there is, as you very, very clearly put, it is an interdisciplinary kind of area of research and study. And not every subject involved is going at the same pace. So, it will have a mixture of, attitudes, applications, and also scientific methods. So much so that, I'm only asking that, is there any mechanism within the existing jurisprudence or existing legal system to check this aspect, while using these kind of techniques? I hope I make sense.
I mean, I think I'd maybe, I'll respond, maybe linking it a little bit to what Arunima was also asking, which is, and I think I did not focus enough on, perhaps recognizing, right, that as you said, sort of the social aspect of what leads to, right? I mean, I think of it as both who gets targeted and for whom the targeting is meant to be a lesson for, right? In other words, that's sort of a big part of this story as well, which is, when we are thinking, for instance, because all of us have been thinking about the Bilkis Bano case, for instance, right? That it was both about her as an individual, right? But it was very much about terrorizing and targeting the Muslim community. And so even the release of it is meant to, it immediately had an impact on one community over the other. So I do think that the social is very, very much a part of this conversation, which often becomes focused on the individual and the law and the system. I will also say that, what is very interesting is that sometimes the scientific techniques also are, linked to sort of a targeting of particular kinds of communities, right? So just to give one example, the whole history of fingerprinting, for instance, is linked in the Indian context to sort of, whether the colonized, the Indians can speak, will actually be able to be identified or not, and therefore you need science, right? Or in the US also with to distinguish between different kinds of immigrants. So I do, I think it's very important for us to sort of think about some of the introduction of these techniques as well as targeting in very, very, socialized terms, right? In very, very, socialized is the wrong word, in terms that take into account the social hierarchies in society. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else who has a question? Please use the raise hand option or unmute yourself. Anyone at all? All right. If we've come to the end of all the questions here, Jinee, thank you so much. Thank you for this very detailed and very interesting talk, and an equally or more interesting response to so many questions which we've been bombarding you with. Thank you. Please come again. We would love to hear more about your new work and the other areas that you're focusing on. Please come back. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. This was such a pleasure. I really, thank you.
Thanks.